Phoenix Suns fans know how special Steve Nash was. 2 MVPs, 10 incredible seasons. But what did he mean for the broader NBA? How do we see what he did showing up today? That's what we're here to talk about, the legacy of those 7 seconds or less teams. What do they mean in the NBA today? Who reminds us of Steve Nash? Is there anybody who does? We'll get into all of it on today's episode of Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons and a writer at Suns.com and Dime Magazine. A big thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday throughout the month of August. A little bit of a trimmed down schedule, but we are not going anywhere. So if you're finding us on your favorite podcast platform, hit that follow button, that subscribe button. Make sure we're in your feed every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you're finding us on YouTube, that's the best way to support the show. A big shout out to all of you. Hit subscribe down below if you've not already. And drop me a comment telling me your favorite Steve Nash memory. We are here to go down the rabbit hole of probably the most beloved Sun in franchise history. I think that's fairly easy to say, although we do have one gentleman who's pushing for that on the current team. But joining me to talk Steve Nash, talk 7 seconds or less, is Mat Issa. He is writing and producing and video editing a massive series over at Basketball News looking at the legacy of players like Steve Nash. So, Matt, I want to just start it here. I have a general question about Steve Nash. I want to let the listeners know first, today's show is brought to you by BetOnline, which is your number one source for sports betting props, odds, and lines all year long. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right. Pretty plain question to start things off, Matt. What do you think if I asked you, give me one sentence after putting together thousands of words and having tons of conversations about Steve Nash in this piece that you put together at Basketball News, if I just said, what's the lasting legacy of Steve Nash in 1 or 2 sentences, what would you tell me?
The lasting legacy is he made it possible for a undersized, unathletic player, conventionally unathletic player, to have a superstar level impact on the game and to, engineer, carry, quarterback, whatever you want to say, not just elite, but like all-time great offenses.
Yeah. I love the word you used in terms saying impact, because I feel like that gets to the root of how this guy affected the game. And you obviously get into this in the piece of scoring average, or even you look at some of, I don't know what his offensive scoring career high is. I don't even think he ever scored 50 in a game. He had some playoff moments where he turned on the aggressiveness a little bit, but it is that impact. I think that the way I would distill it, the way that I kind of put it together in my notes is he was just a guy who was truly committed to making others better above everything. And you combine that with this surreal level of skill. And that combination is pretty unique, because I think there's been unselfish players before, but they didn't quite have that same level of skill and just even just coordination, hand-eye coordination, vision, all that good stuff that made him who he was. The combination of that plus the unselfishness is, I think, what sets him apart for sure. What is there a comment or quote from the people that you talk to? I mean, you talked to Mike D'Antoni, you talked to Rajon Rondo. Is there a quote that stands out to you kind of about the essence of what Nash was from your conversations?
Well, D'Antoni called him not just the greatest decision maker he'd ever coached, but the greatest decision maker ever. And I mean, for D'Antoni to say that, obviously, coaches always love to talk about the guy who made them a lot of money. Nash made D'Antoni a lot of money, made him a very famous coach. But for him to say that, and just for the breadth of experience he's had, the breadth of things he's had to see in his career, whether that be as a player in the NBA, in the Italian league, then coaching overseas, and then in the NBA, coaching all these great players, coaching another player the Suns are very familiar with in Chris Paul, and to say that Nash was the best decision maker of all time, I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know about him.
Yeah, I mean, James Harden, Kobe
Mm,
Bryant, Carmelo Anthony, Amari Stoudemire. He's coached incredible players, and I think it's funny with Nash because and I mentioned at the top of the show myself, kind of making fun of myself here because for some reason I've stepped in it a little bit recently. It's been the off season. We're waiting on this Kevin Durant stuff to drop, and I've just been we've already been having some of those very off-season-y shows here
mm,
on Locked On Suns, and I've found myself almost arguing against Nash, but I actually love Steve Nash, and so I need to just apologize to everybody who I put through that. I don't know what I'm doing. I lost control of myself. I'm embarrassed that I did such a thing, but it is this funny thing with Nash because, like, for the quote that you just said, to be decision making, like, that's not a flashy sexy thing to be on the top line of a player's resume, right? That's not
mm.
like, oh, he was incredible decision maker. It's like that's really cool, but if you say that about like an NFL quarterback, it's like, Alex Smith or something, right? It's like these guys who just kind of control the game, get you over the finish line. They're not probably going to be the reason you win, they're not going to be the reason you lose. But for Nash, that was like the exact opposite of what it meant. And his ability to have his fingerprints over everything was what made him so special. I want to get into a stat that you had that I think speaks to that, in terms of the level of dominance that he oversaw on the Suns offense. But before we get to that, just while we're talking about his uniqueness and kind of what set him apart, Matt, I'm curious. He feels very one of one to me for a lot of the
Mhm.
reasons we're talking about. But is there anybody who reminds you of him who not necessarily is in the NBA right now still, but at least has come through the league since he was drafted in the late 90s?
Yeah, I see so much Nash in today's game. And I think that part of the series and the point of him being included in the series is he's revolutionary. And, for someone to be revolutionary, they have to have had like a widespread impact, like the true unicorns, they come around once and you can't really find another one. Nash wasn't a unicorn. He inspired a generation of players. Trae Young being probably the most obvious comparison. Like, well on the record as saying Nash inspired him. I see a lot of Darius Garland in him.
Mm,
Fred
yeah.
VanVleet has talked about mimicking Nash's dribble probe, the Nashing dribble. Off the top of my head, there's one more I'm missing that I pointed out. Steph Curry, of course. Steph Curry, the multi-sport athlete, incredible hand-eye coordination, incredible shooter. And I think Steph was able to take it to another level because he added the off-ball element, which reminds me of another player that I'll be talking about a little bit later in this series with the off-ball gravity and the insane three-point shooting and whatnot.
Yeah, I want to talk. So the Steph one
Mm,
is it's funny because I think with a lot of Steph comparisons, it's really hard because I mean maybe we'll be talking about Steph similarly if the next basketball news series becomes it comes in 10 years and Nash will probably or Curry would probably be one of those guys, right?
mhm,
We might see the next Currys coming up in years to come, but he is so unique. His style is almost nothing like Nash's in terms of the places that they are on the floor, the ways that they're used, the times and the shot clock that they have. Like it's all
mhm.
so different, but yet their overall impact is pretty similar. But yeah, Trae Young, I think Chris Paul, the player who Suns fans have gotten to see up close for the past couple of years, I feel like is somebody in terms of being able to probe a defense, being able to really set teammates up in places that he knows they're going to flourish. I think is something that really like. I think Trey's still getting that. He's young. Garland is young. I mean, I think Trey is finding that balance of being the more aggressive kind of like generational version of Nash, and it's the balance that I think Nash himself has kind of criticize the past version of himself on, of like, maybe I should have been more aggressive. But then you see with Trey that, well, now he gets criticized that he should be less aggressive. So it is pretty fascinating. But the one that I don't hear talked about a lot, and I'm not sure if you brought up in your piece, is Rajon Rondo. I feel like he kind of gets forgotten, but aside from the shooting ability, like, he was one of those guys who really had, just an offense in the palm of his hand in his prime.
Yeah. Okay, so the Rondo one's interesting because the thing with Rondo, he racked up a lot of assists and he's an incredibly cerebral player, high IQ, but I think he reminds me, today I make the comparison, right? Think of Rondo and Nash as like DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. And it's kind of funny because they play on the same team now, but like DeJounte Murray averaged almost a triple-double last year, and the Spurs were in the bottom half of the league in offensive efficiency. I love DeJounte Murray, by the way. I think he's going to be awesome on the Hawks. But in the context of the Spurs, when you have him quarterbacking your offense, it doesn't look as sexy. The numbers aren't as great because he doesn't make the high value, the high leverage passes. I like to think of the point guard, they make about like 6 different passes, right? They make the lob pass, the skip pass, the lay down pass, the pocket pass, the kick out pass, and the outlet pass. Outlet being like the outlet pass and fast break. And I would say the most valuable ones are the lob pass, the lay down pass, which is just like you penetrate and it's basically like a layup pass, but not the lob. And then the skip pass, which, everyone knows nowadays. And I think those 3 are the most valuable because they usually lead to either like layups, which is the best shot in the game, layups or dunks, and then the corner 3, the open, semi-openish corner 3. And Nash made a lot of those, whereas someone like Rondo or Murray, they make a little bit more of the, the kick out pass, the pocket pass, which is important, but it doesn't create as high value of a shot. And that's why you see usually the offenses that they quarterbacked don't have that, elite all-time level efficiency.
I like that. I appreciate you deconstructing that one, because I went back and looked while you were talking, and you look at some of, like, probably 11-12 was Rondo's best season. I mean, he wasn't really super healthy in any of his best seasons, so it's kind of hard to pick sometimes. But that year was the year he had the great playoff series against Miami. The Celtics offense in the regular season that year was 27th, right? And that's, they were hurt constantly. Again, it is difficult. I'm not saying that that's a perfect approximation of what his value is to an offense, but I think the comparisons that you did bring up, and I think especially when we're looking now at somebody like Trae Young, these guys were offenses unto themselves, right? And that ability to make all of the teammates better, I loved the way you just put it, because you're putting into like X's and O's terms what that really means. What does it actually mean to make your teammates better? It's not just something that we see because their points per game go up, but it's, you really can set people up in all of the different spots that they might be on the floor. And if a general manager is able to equip the roster with the right types of guys, then you're really cooking. And I think, maybe different players we've talked about have done that at different times, but usually when you had Nash on your team, when you've had Trae Young on your team, your offense was going to be pretty good. That actually transitions perfectly to the stat that you bring up in the article that I want to go over. Just about the longevity of dominance of the Suns offense under Nash. We'll get to that in just a second. First today, guys, the show is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your sports betting needs. Find sports, events, news, and then, of course, odds, props, and lines every day, constantly updated. Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, everything in terms of major sports, but also the smaller stuff, whether you're looking forward to the World Cup, not of course small, but a little smaller in America, maybe golf tournaments, fight, combat sports, all of it. BetOnline, your top resource for sports wagering info. They also have live betting, esports, odds, and more. So head to betonline.net today or use their mobile app to learn more about the latest trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Matt. So in the piece, you have this stat, which is that under Steve Nash, Phoenix finished top 2 in the league in offensive rating every season from 2004 to 2010. For reference, the only other all-time primary ball handler to accomplish this was Magic Johnson from 84 to 90. And it's safe to say those offensively slanted Lakers teams were indeed championship caliber as well. That's something that just like, I mean, like you literally put it, Magic Johnson, I mean, there's just not a lot of players who have ever been able to sustain that for such a long time. And that to me might be the most indicative kind of legacy building stat that you could put out there about Steve Nash, because we talked about the offensive numbers for him, aside from assists, weren't always that high, but just shepherding elite level teams, no matter who was on the roster. You see that span has Joe Johnson, it has Shaq, it has Amare healthy, it has Amare hurt, it has a good backup point guard, it has not so good backup point guards, and all that time, because they had Steve Nash, they were elite. That's pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah, another interesting stat that I didn't get to put in the article because it so basically the statistic is called adjusted offensive rating, and it belongs to a website called The Analyst that I do some work for, and they have a database that goes back until 1986, and basically it spits out like a one number one number metric similar to like a box plus minus, but for offensive rating, comparing cross eras from 1986 to present day. And the top five offenses, according to this stat, four of them belong to Nash-led teams. Two of them were Phoenix Nash-led teams. Two of them were Dallas Nash-led teams. And the other one was, I believe, the 95-96 Chicago Bulls. So it just tells you, like, the breadth, like, the the pedigree of the offenses that Nash was leading during his prime. So in Dallas and with, of course,
Yeah.
the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's
Mm-hmm.
and the thing that I think I try to remind myself of as I'm, you know, contextualizing what those teams were able to do is also not just the sustained excellence that you just went over, or some of the individual greatness of the pieces of those teams, or the revolutionary way that they played, but it's how much better they were than their competition. Because the other thing that I think probably, is part of why the revolutionary part of their legacy does get talked about a lot, but also I think the actual dominance gets undersold, is that the league was in a really rough place. Like, this is a time when a lot of the other offenses, especially, are just kind of boring, and the talent is getting a little bit dried out after, it's kind of like early in LeBron's career, and then Kobe's in this weird in between after Shaq, but before Pow. And the Spurs are, dominant, but not the sexiest teams to watch. They win through defense a lot and post play and these types of things. And then the Suns just come along and just completely are head and shoulders above whatever anybody else is trying to do. I like what you did in this article, because you break down some of, like, in deeper terms, what made the spread pick and roll innovative. And obviously we know the Suns kind of brought this to the NBA in a really consistent way, and they popularized it, and now it's something you can't ignore if you're watching basketball. But can you break down for the listeners just a little bit of the elements of what went into them playing that way, and how that was different than maybe the other pick and roll offense that had come before it, or just the way that coaches and players thought back then?
Yeah. So first, a little bit of background, right? People call them the 7 seconds or less Suns, and it's funny because if you talk to like D'Antoni or Raja or anybody involved on that team, they're like, "What are they talking about? Like we didn't go in the transition that much. We were like, if you look at our pace, like we would probably be in the bottom part of the league today, and they would be. They were an incredible half court offense, and that was because of things like the pistol offense and the spread pick and roll. And so before during the illegal defensive time, where there used to be illegal defense rules, you couldn't play zone defense, right? So a lot of teams would clear out three guys on one side and then have on the other side the ball handler and a screener and try to get them in some sort of pick and roll or post up action. Once the illegal defensive rules changed, you could play zone defense again. Teams started to do something where they would so when the pick and roll took place, right, and D'Antoni talks about this a lot, he wants to exploit the need to tag the roller. So when the pick and roll takes place and the screener rolls, they usually have a defender because they would hedge the big man. So that means somebody on the back line would have to tag the roller, slow them down for a second while the big man recovered. Well, the Suns wanted to take advantage of that. So while that guy was tagging the roller, they would have Nash, fling that pass to the guy that was getting tagged. So then it's like, okay, that low man's like, should I tag this roller because I don't want to give up that three. But if they don't tag the roller, it's Amari Stoudemire, which is like the equivalent of a freight train running at you, and you need to slow that guy down. So that put teams in a bind with hedging, and so if you went into drop, it's like you've seen today what happens when teams drop against the Suns and Chris Paul. It was very similar experience with Nash and his mid-range pull-up. And then when teams would switch, because they didn't really have the personnel back then, a lot of teams, to have their five switch onto a guard like Nash. So if you switched onto Nash, he wasn't a fast north to south guy, but if you put like a big Zydrunas Ilgauskas type, he was gonna bull rush past him. So that spread pick and roll really put people in a bind. And the key to it, we talked about D'Antoni calling Nash the greatest decision maker of all time, it was up to Nash. The onus was on Nash to make the right decision. Because basically, and I talk about this in the article, in the video I put out in the article, there's five options to that spread pick and roll. It's either the point guard scores, the screener scores, or one of the three shooters based on the perimeter. And it's up to Nash to assess the defensive coverage and decide which one is the optimal output for that possession. And that he had to do that, 30, 40, 50 times a game. And not just more times than not, but like 90, 95% of the time, he's making the right decision. And throughout the course of an 82-game season and a 10-year run to be constantly making the right decision, I mean, you have a strong case as one of the great decision makers that ever lived.
Absolutely. And I think that's where some of that stuff of the people part of,
Mm-hmm.
The making the teammates better stuff. There's that component of doing it based upon what the defense is giving you, but there's also okay, well, we know I think Rajon was a great teammate. I think he was perfectly willing and able to buy in, but he's a guy who is giving his all on defense, is sacrificing. You need to keep that guy involved. You need to keep that guy happy. He's also talented, right? But then you have Amare, who's probably going to be an amazing option for you most of the time down the floor. And then you have these shooters who would cycle in and out, and you have these other guys. So and then not to mention Sean Marion, who always had his own challenges regarding the amount that he was felt like he should be, sacrificing versus what other guys were doing, and the way that he had to adapt his game to play the small ball that they played and all this and that. And that, just to add in that he was this beloved teammate on top of that level of burden he was carrying of creating this amazing offense every season. I think we're getting to it. I feel like I am able to. It's a good reminder for me. Like I was saying,
I'm curious. What kind of criticism were you giving Nash earlier this offseason?
Just so we did our rankings last week
Mm-hmm.
of like top 5 favorite Suns, and I had Nash 2 and Book 1. This was not best or greatest or whatever. It was just like, who do you love? But of course, you can't ignore the greatest players. So there's a balance there, right? And like I did this whole spiel about like, I was kind of thinking about dropping Nash even to like 3 or something. And I dug myself a hole there. I just think like you can forget because it wasn't flashy. And I think too, because they didn't have like so many as somebody who grew up here and rooted for the Suns growing up and whatnot, it's like a lot of the big memories are failures, right? Like that's a bummer about his career. So if you sit with that like disappointment too much, and there's not like the flashy, holy crap, like Jordan scoring 63 against the Celtics, or like the countless buzzer beating shots he hit and all like these other superstar players, you can kind of convince yourself like, was he really? Like, I don't know. Is it? But of course, like we're talking about, I think that's kind of a silly way to think about it.
I don't blame you, favorite players. There's a certain like flashy sexiness to Booker's tough shot making. That's really, it's hard not to love it. And then Booker, like especially this past season, he's really kind of bought into the defensive side and really just making it a point to kind of let you know he's there. Like he wants to play defense. He's pulling his shorts up. He's yelling. He's taking charges. I definitely have noticed that. So I could see why you would prefer Booker more, especially with like there is like a lot of I'm like, I'm surprised Nash is able to live like a regular life, man. There's just a lot of unfortunate circumstances. It seems like every season during the D'Antoni era, something went wrong for the Suns that kind of stopped them from being able to, reach their full potential. Something that was like outside of their control.
Absolutely, and we will try to avoid depressing people too much with those memories. I do want to talk about the legacy of this team, though, and some
Hmm.
of the ways that this project has helped you understand kind of this modern era. We'll get into that next after one quick break. All right, Matt. So this project is called Blazing the Trail, and you are looking at the ways not only that these players impacted their eras, impacted their teams, why they were just great players or under maybe misunderstood or under evaluated players, but especially how they changed the game because we're fully in the middle of whatever this modern era is. And it's fascinating to look back at who the kind of pioneers were. But with that said, the 7 seconds or less Suns we've talked about, they're fast paced, lots of threes, but really it pales in comparison to the numbers that you see today, right? It's like their pace, seconds per possession, maybe it's a little bit more competitive with some of the teams in recent years, but pace straight up, they're slowed down by their opponents. The score is not 130 like you might think based on the perception. It's pretty normal. Spread pick and roll, yes, they did it, but probably even less than a lot of teams do now. So they very clearly paved the way for what the league would become, and the league has even intensified that style to another degree now. Do you think that that change has been good or bad for basketball? I know that's a overly simple way to ask the question, but I just want to hear your thoughts because there's a lot of people who feel like there's just a lot of the same in basketball right now, and I can't help but look toward those Suns and feel like they brought that into basketball a little
Hmm.
bit.
Yeah, I mean, when the Suns, it's funny enough because like when the Suns did what they did, the league was struggling with a lot of like sameness, a lot of post ups, a lot of ISOs, a lot of that stuff, a lot of the empty corner, spread out stuff. And then they came and they zagged. They zagged really hard when everyone else was zigging. And I think, there is like to an extent, there's a right way, I guess, to go about certain things in efficiency wise. That's a very efficient way to play. You need efficiency to win games. But even D'Antoni has said like as much like there is no like one way to squeeze jello and have it come out. He uses this analogy. You can't squeeze jello and have it come out like the same way every single time. There's just different ways to go about it. And it's still KYP, know your personnel. Every team's going to vary a little bit. And I think that this year we've seen a lot of diversity in a lot of the different approaches teams are going with. Like for example, the Cleveland Cavaliers, they're playing this jumbo lineup, Lauri Markkanen and Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, all these big guys. So yeah, the spread pick and roll is very prominent. And some people I guess they don't like the sameness. Maybe that's the appeal for some people towards college basketball. But I mean, there's still like a lot of different parts. There's a lot like each team has identifiable features that make them a little bit different from the other teams. But no, like no, to answer your question, I think the Suns brought a beautiful element to the game that's allowed a lot of great players to kind of flourish and come into their own. So yeah, that's just me rambling now at this point.
No, I think if anyone prefers college basketball, first of all, they should just hibernate until the game gets bad again or something because I'm entertained by college basketball in its own way, but
Hmm.
that is and you're not wrong. People do feel that way. They're all wrong. So it's
Hmm.
okay.
I
But
agree with you that they are wrong.
it's silly. I think the thing about the Suns and where I kind of come down on the evolutionary stuff is like somebody was going to play that way eventually.
Hmm.
And what's kind of cool is how that the Suns did it first and that they had this unique player in Nash and to a lesser degree, somebody like Marion who kind of made it work and the freight train that you called Amare, I completely agree. Somebody who could put the ball on the ground, but also had this power to his game that was just impossible to stop. Like the way that they did it is what makes it some kind of this unique memory. But I do think somebody was always going to play that way, just like if the Rockets hadn't done what they did and went heavy ISO and even more threes, somebody was going to do that when the personnel suited it. It's not like these things, like basketball has rules and people are going to figure out how to manipulate them to make it work for the players that they have. And people aren't going to be that different in terms of what they're able to do athletically. Like these things are just natural, I feel like, and they come whether you decide that they should come or you love how it looks. Like, I just think that was always going to be the case. So I don't think there's really much to criticize the 7 seconds or less teams for. And I do agree with you. Like now, yeah, is it a faster game pretty universally? Are there more threes? Sure. But like, a spread pick and roll when it's, Giannis as a screener or Giannis as a ball handler, or a spread pick and roll when it's maybe, really more of a dribble handoff between Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic, or if it's, Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert before they fell apart, and Mitchell taking a pull-up three, or Lillard doing the same with Nurkic. Like, yes, maybe the end result, and Seth Partnow of The Athletic has always put it this way, like the end result might often be the same, but like the process getting there is completely different in the NBA. And a lot of the times it looks nothing like what the 7 seconds or less Suns were doing, unless maybe you're in Atlanta, right? So like, I don't have much of a problem with it either. I think the other part that kind of, I guess, maybe represents what we've seen since then, and I'm curious with your idea, but I was kind of trying to think about this, like how is the modern NBA taken what those Suns teams did, and even made it better? And it feels like maybe because Nash is less replicable, but they kind of took the Marion part and they were like, all right, can we get 10 of these per team? Can we get 10 Marions on every team? And then, maybe we'll find our Nash along the way, or maybe one of the Marions is actually just a freak who can be our offensive engine. And that's really cool. That's kind of where we are now, where it's like the small ball elements, the versatility elements, that type of stuff is really what we've seen teams seize way more than like, all right, we got to find our Nash, because maybe that's harder to do. Maybe it is easier to find the 6'7" guys and mold them than it is to find this, skilled alien man who can control everything in an offense. But what do you think about that? How have you seen the evolution since that point, and building on what those 7 seconds or less teams did?
Yeah, without spoiling too much, with the Sean Kemp portion, we get at this a lot, and it's like, Sean Kemp. During a time when it's, post-ups, these methodical post-ups, isolation sequences for big man. Think Hakeem Olajuwon, Karl Malone, right? I think Sean Kemp was a really good roll man, really good lob finisher, really good face-up game. And then on defense, really good rim protector, good roamer, good weak side rim protector, all that stuff. And in today's game, if you don't have that offensive supernova, think Nikola Jokic, Karl Anthony Towns, you want that your big to be kind of like a Sean Kemp. And Sean Kemp, of course, the parallel to him in the mid-2000s would be Amari Stoudemire. Offensively, defensively, Kemp's a better defender. But so that type of player. And I know this is like a sore subject in Phoenix right now, but like DeAndre Ayton, he fits that. He fits that archetype pretty well. And people want to talk about his versatility. I think he's a pretty versatile big man for his size. But again, that's a different conversation for a different day. But so yeah, we're seeing that evolution basically now, where it's like that's a very desirable archetype, and it's something that I don't want to say it's like it grows on trees, but it's a lot more attainable than you said, like finding this all-time level decision maker, or finding an offensive supernova big man like a Jokic or Karl Anthony Towns.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's I guess, like, I was mentioning the Marion evolution, people who have built on what that archetype was. And I mean, you could point to any number of people, Pascal Siakam or, Draymond Green, those types of players. But I think you're right. There's been that evolution of the Amare archetype too, right? And you're right to point out, even he was taking from, there's all of that through history. I'm sure somebody older would say that Marion wasn't the first to be like himself, and there was a pre-Marion Sean Marion too.
So not to talk too much about the other players in the series, but like another guy gets spotlighted, same era as Sean Marion, Andre Kirilenko, very similar type of player, defensively, offensively, similar. So there's just like you're saying, you know what I mean? I agree with you that, and that gets talked about a lot more, kind of that, again, like we said, play finisher on offense, low maintenance offensive player, can play by the .5 rule, 0.5 seconds to make a basketball move, whatever, that all the coaches love for their non-superstars. And then on defense is a defender of, because today and Mike Prada is I just talked to him yesterday for a different part of the series, but, he's got a book coming out called Spaceball. He wants me to tell everyone about it, so make sure you buy. I mean, Spaced Out, not Spaceball. But anyways,
Yes,
it's about the space
Mike is
revolution. Yeah, he's awesome. But it's about the space revolution, and to guard all of this space, you need defenders who can take up a lot of space. Think like today, not saying he's a Marion comparison, but think about Herb Jones. Herb Jones is great at defending space. Mikal Bridges, the guy in Phoenix. Things of that nature. So yeah,
Yep.
those archetypes. That team is just filled with revolutionary kind of pieces. I mean, Marion, Nash, Stoudemire, D'Antoni. Today, coaches need to be more like D'Antoni. D'Antoni's really, for the most part, in terms of his personnel, by all accounts, pretty laid back guy. He ran a read and react type offense where it's not really him calling plays. You don't see too many plays called on offense anymore. It's all reads. You have reads now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, a guy I love and another player that intersected careers with a guy who we've talked about on this show and Suns fans are familiar with is Blake Griffin, who obviously played with Chris Paul, and he's kind of the, he started to add the spacing element to the offensive game and as that pick and roll big and the passing and short roll stuff and whatever. So yeah, it is cool to think kind of the ways that the league branched out from what the Suns introduced. Do we all in Phoenix wish that those introductions had come with championships? Of course, but I do hope this was a fun way to look back on the legacy of those teams, for me to remind myself of why Steve Nash is such a special player, and for Matt to get to talk about his series. So let people know, Matt, where they can check all of this good stuff out and all the components to it.
Yeah, easiest way, go on basketballnews.com. We have sort of the Instagram story type bubbles. And you could scroll a bit, you find my name, Mat Issa. You can click on it, you can see the articles that are up right now. So far as of recording this, Nash and Rashard Lewis, those parts are out. You could find the articles and podcast portions of that. And then Thursday, Shane Battier's portion will be coming out. And on a weekly basis, we'll have the other 7 coming out. You can follow me on Twitter as well, at MATISSA15. I tweet about it a lot and about the random historical games I find myself watching.
Awesome. That'll do it for today, guys. Check out the series. I will be for sure. If anything gets anywhere near the Suns, we might have to have Matt back on to talk about this stuff. It's perfect August NBA content. It's fun to reminisce. It's fun to think about the X's and O's evolution of the game as we head toward another season. But that'll do it for today. Back Friday with Aaron Edwards talking about – we need to talk about this tweet that Quick Trip put out about trading Mikal Bridges and how Mikal Bridges responded. So I'm sure we'll have some fun with that to close out the week. But that will be Friday. I will talk to you guys then. Until then, make Locked On NBA your second listen to catch up on all things NBA.